In the year 1845, deep in the northern wilderness of Maine, there stood a remote property known as Blackwood Farm, a place so isolated that even seasoned travelers often failed to mark it correctly on their maps, surrounded by dense pine forests, frozen earth, and a silence that felt heavier than the winter snow itself. And within that silence lived four sisters whose existence unsettled everyone who knew of them, though very few could say they truly knew them at all. The people of the nearest village spoke of the sisters in lowered voices, referring to them simply as the four sisters of Blackwood Farm, as if giving them individual names might grant them too much reality or invite unwanted attention. And while official records did list their births and lineage, those documents were rarely consulted, as if even paper recoiled from telling their full story. The sisters had lived on the farm since childhood, inheriting it after the deaths of their parents, events that themselves were cloaked in uncertainty and rumor, with some villagers claiming illness, others whispering of accidents, and a few daring souls suggesting darker causes that no one wished to examine too closely. From the moment the sisters were left alone on the property, something about them changed in the eyes of the community, or perhaps the change existed only in perception, but either way, the result was the same. The sisters withdrew entirely from village life, no longer attending church, no longer participating in seasonal gatherings, no longer engaging in casual conversation at the market, except when absolutely necessary, and even then they spoke only a few quiet words, their eyes fixed downward, their expressions unreadable. They dressed plainly in outdated clothing that seemed frozen in an earlier decade, as though time itself moved around Blackwood Farm, but never through it, and they were rarely seen during daylight hours, which led many to speculate that they slept through most of the day and lived their true lives at night. After sunset, lantern light could often be seen glowing faintly from the farmhouse windows, steady and unwavering even during fierce snowstorms, and travelers passing through the forest roads claimed that the light sometimes shifted from window to window as if carried by unseen hands, though no figures were ever clearly visible behind the glass. Some villagers swore they heard voices drifting from the direction of the farm late at night, soft and rhythmic, not quite singing, not quite speaking, but repeating in patterns that unsettled the listener, and when these claims were brought up in public, they were quickly dismissed as imagination or the natural sounds of wind moving through trees. Yet the unease remained. Each of the sisters possessed a presence that lingered long after they had passed from view, and though they bore a striking resemblance to one another, those who observed them closely noted subtle differences that only deepened the mystery. The eldest sister carried herself with a rigid composure, her posture straight, her face almost devoid of emotion, as if she had assumed the role of guardian or keeper of something long before she was ready to bear such a burden, while the second sister often lingered near windows or doorways, gazing outward with an intensity that suggested longing or vigilance, though no one could say for certain which, and the third sister moved slowly, deliberately, her steps measured, her breathing sometimes visible, even in warmer months, giving the impression of quiet exhaustion that never seemed to lift. The youngest sister unsettled people the most, not because of anything she said or did, but because of the faint, inappropriate smile that sometimes appeared on her face without warning, a smile that carried no warmth and faded as abruptly as it arrived, leaving observers unsure whether they had imagined it at all. Children were warned to stay away from Blackwood Farm, told stories of curses and wandering spirits to ensure they obeyed, and even adults avoided the path that led too close to the property, choosing longer routes through the woods rather than passing its boundary fence, which itself was old and broken in places, though no one ever attempted to cross it. Animals behaved strangely near the farm, horses refusing to move forward, dogs whining and pulling at their leashes, birds falling silent as they flew overhead, and hunters reported that game became scarce in the surrounding area, as if instinctively avoiding the land. There was an old well on the property, dug decades earlier, its stone rim cracked and darkened by age, and while the sisters were seen drawing water from it regularly, no one else dared to drink from it after rumors spread that the water caused vivid nightmares and lingering unease, though these claims were never officially investigated. Despite the harsh winters and limited visible resources, the sisters never appeared malnourished or ill, a fact that puzzled those who tracked such things, and some villagers quietly questioned how they survived at all, given that no one recalled seeing regular supply deliveries or successful harvests from the frozen soil. The local priest made several attempts to visit the farmhouse, driven partly by duty and partly by curiosity, but each time he was turned away politely yet firmly, the door opening just enough for a voice to assure him that all was well and that no assistance was required, and after repeated refusals, even he ceased his visits, later admitting that the atmosphere of the place unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Over time, Blackwood Farm became less a location and more a symbol, representing something unspoken that lingered at the edges of rational thought, a reminder that not everything fit neatly into the explanations people preferred, and though no crime was ever associated with the sisters, no overt act of violence or public scandal, the sense that something was wrong never faded. The year 1845 progressed with an especially severe winter, snow piling higher than usual, roads becoming nearly impassable, and during that time the lantern light at Blackwood Farm burned longer and brighter than ever, visible even from distant hills, and some claimed that the light did not flicker as ordinary flame should, but remained eerily constant, defying wind and weather. On several mornings, strange marks were found in the snow near the property, patterns that did not resemble animal tracks or human footprints, spiraling or intersecting in ways that made no practical sense, and by the time anyone gathered the courage to investigate, fresh snowfall had erased them, leaving only the memory and the unease behind. The sisters themselves continued their routines without interruption, seen occasionally at the edge of the woods or near the well, never acknowledging the stares they attracted, never responding to whispered questions, existing as if governed by a set of rules entirely their own. As months passed, the villagers began to accept the presence of the sisters as an uncomfortable but permanent feature of their world, something to be avoided rather than understood, and this acceptance allowed the mystery to deepen unchecked, growing roots in the collective imagination. There were nights when the wind carried what sounded like laughter from the direction of the farm, though no one could say whose laughter it was or why it sounded so distant and hollow, and there were mornings when frost patterns on nearby windows formed shapes that reminded people of faces, though these too were dismissed as coincidence. Still, the four sisters of Blackwood Farm remained untouched by scrutiny, protected by isolation, fear, and a shared agreement that some questions were better left unanswered. And as the year drew closer to its end, an unspoken tension settled over the region, as though something long dormant beneath the frozen ground was stirring, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And though no one could yet articulate it, many sensed that the quiet existence of the sisters was merely the beginning of a story far darker than anyone was prepared to confront. The first death came quietly, so quietly that for several days no one beyond Blackwood Farm even knew it had happened, and when the news finally reached the village, it arrived not as a cry for help or a call for witnesses, but as a stiff, emotionless statement delivered by one of the sisters herself, who appeared at the edge of town just after dawn, her boots damp with snow, her face pale but composed, informing the general store owner that her eldest sister had passed away during the night and that burial arrangements would be handled privately, a declaration so abrupt and so devoid of visible grief that it left the man speechless. In 1845, death was not unfamiliar to rural Maine, yet there was something unsettling about the way this one was announced. No request for a doctor, no appeal to the church, no mention of illness or accident, only the flat certainty that it had already happened and that no further involvement was required. Word spread quickly, as it always did, and by midday the village was buzzing with speculation, some assuming the harsh winter had finally claimed a life, others whispering that whatever strange endurance had kept the sisters alive for so long had finally failed. But when a small group of men, driven by custom and concern, approached Blackwood Farm that evening to offer assistance, They were stopped at the gate by the remaining three sisters, who stood together in silence, blocking the path without hostility, yet without invitation, their expressions calm to the point of coldness. And after a long, uncomfortable pause, they were told that the body had already been prepared, and that no visitors would be allowed. What unsettled the men most was not the refusal itself, but the absence of any visible mourning. No black veils, no trembling hands, no tears, nothing that aligned with the rituals of grief everyone understood, and though they eventually left, unease followed them back to the village like a shadow. 2 days later, the burial took place, if it could be called that at all, witnessed only from a distance by a pair of hunters who happened to be passing through the woods and later reported seeing the sisters carrying a coffin toward a small clearing near the old well, moving slowly but steadily, their breath visible in the cold air, and though the men could not see the body, they claimed the coffin appeared unusually heavy for its size, requiring all three women to lift it. And when the ground was disturbed, it was done with careful precision, as if the sisters had practiced this act before. No church blessing marked the grave, no headstone was placed, and by the following morning, fresh snow had covered the disturbed earth, erasing nearly all signs of the burial. What troubled the village further was the rumor that emerged days later from a reclusive midwife who claimed she had once assisted at Blackwood farm years earlier and had seen the eldest sister then, remarking that she appeared unchanged even after decades, and now, according to whispers, those who glimpsed the body before it was buried said the same thing, that there were no signs of decay, no discoloration, no stiffness, as though death itself had arrived but forgotten to leave its mark. These accounts were impossible to verify, yet they spread rapidly, feeding an already fertile ground of fear and curiosity, and when the local doctor, a man trained enough to recognize the signs of common illnesses, offered to examine the body retroactively, he was refused without explanation, the sisters sending word that the matter was closed. Weeks passed, and the remaining sisters resumed their routines with little visible change, the lantern light still burning at night, the well still in use, the farm still silent, and just as the village began to settle into a fragile acceptance of this strange loss, the second death occurred. This time, there was no announcement at all, no visit to town, no words spoken, and it was only when smoke failed to rise from the farmhouse chimney for several days that concern resurfaced, prompting the same group of men to approach the property once more, only to find the gate open and the yard undisturbed, the farmhouse door ajar. Inside, they found the second sister laid out neatly on a table, her hands folded over her chest, her face serene, her skin cool to the touch but otherwise unchanged. And what struck them immediately was the absence of any odor, any visible sign that the body had been there longer than a few hours, despite evidence suggesting she had died days earlier. The remaining two sisters stood nearby, watching in silence, neither protesting nor welcoming the intrusion, and when the doctor arrived shortly thereafter and attempted a cursory examination, he found no wounds, no signs of struggle, no fever marks, nothing that explained the death, and before he could proceed further, the sisters requested that he leave, their voices calm but firm, insisting that no cutting or invasive examination would be permitted. Bound by social boundaries and perhaps his own discomfort, the doctor complied, later admitting that he felt an inexplicable pressure to withdraw, as if remaining would have been a violation not just of privacy, but of something deeper and more dangerous. The burial followed the same pattern as the first, private, swift and unmarked, the ground near the well receiving another hidden grave, and again, snowfall erased the evidence almost immediately, leaving behind only the growing sense that something profoundly unnatural was unfolding. By the time the third death occurred, fear had replaced curiosity entirely, and when the third sister failed to appear at the well for water, failed to light the lanterns at dusk, the village knew without being told what had happened. Yet no one volunteered to approach the farm, not even the priest, who later confessed that he felt as though the land itself was warning him away. Days later, a traveller passing through the woods claimed to see only one light burning in the farmhouse, moving slowly from room to room, and when the remaining sister finally emerged to request supplies, her appearance shocked those who saw her, not because she looked weakened by loss, but because she appeared exactly as she always had, unchanged by grief, time, or hardship, her eyes steady, her voice even, as she requested flour, oil, and nails, paying in old coins that bore dates far earlier than expected. No mention was made of her sisters, no explanation offered, and when questioned gently, she simply said that they were at rest, a phrase so vague it silenced further inquiry. The third body, according to the one man who claimed to have seen it, was colder than the others, yet still bore that same disturbing preservation, the skin intact. Features peaceful, as though the moment of death had been suspended indefinitely, and when the doctor again attempted to intervene, this time insisting that multiple unexplained deaths required investigation, his request was denied by a council decision influenced heavily by fear, superstition, and the sisters' growing reputation, and the graves were sealed more carefully than before, stones placed over the soil, not to mark the dead, but to ensure they remained undisturbed. By the time only one sister remained, the story of the four sisters of Blackwood Farm had transformed into something darker than rumor, becoming a cautionary tale told in fragments, each retelling more distorted than the last. And when the final sister died, she did so without witnesses, without announcement, without ceremony, discovered only weeks later when the lantern light finally went dark and did not return. The men who entered the farmhouse that time found her seated upright in a chair near the window, her eyes closed, her expression almost content, her body preserved in the same unnatural state as the others, and though by then even the most rational among them felt the weight of something profoundly wrong, no autopsy was performed, no records were updated beyond the bare minimum, and the graves, now four, were sealed permanently, their locations recorded vaguely if at all, and in official documents, the deaths were attributed simply to natural causes, an act of God, a phrase broad enough to close the case while explaining nothing. From that moment on, Blackwood Farm was abandoned, yet the ground near the well remained undisturbed, guarded not by fences or law, but by an unspoken agreement that some truths, once buried, must never be unearthed. And the mystery of the four sisters passed from lived experience into legend, leaving behind sealed graves, unanswered questions, and a lingering sense that death itself had behaved differently on that land, as though bound by rules no one dared to study. Years passed after Blackwood Farm fell silent, and with each passing winter the memory of the four sisters faded from daily conversation, retreating into the realm of half-forgotten stories, told only when the fire burned low and the wind pressed too hard against the windows. Yet the truth was never fully erased, only buried beneath layers of time and deliberate neglect. It was in the late 1860s when the past stirred again, not through rumor or superstition, but through ink on fragile paper, when a young physician named Elias Harper arrived in Maine from Boston, carrying with him the confidence of modern medical training and the quiet arrogance of someone who believed that reason could illuminate any shadow. Harper had come north seeking both work and purpose, having grown dissatisfied with city hospitals where death was common but meaning felt scarce, and it was during his early months in the region that he first heard whispers of Blackwood Farm, not as ghost story, but as an unresolved medical curiosity mentioned offhandedly by an aging doctor during a private conversation. The older man spoke reluctantly, his voice dropping as he described four women who had died without visible cause, whose bodies showed no sign of decay even days after death, and whose graves were sealed so tightly that no one dared disturb them. And though he dismissed the story as an uncomfortable anomaly, Harper sensed hesitation beneath the dismissal, a suggestion that something important had been intentionally left unexplored. Curiosity took hold quickly, growing into obsession, and Harper began quietly asking questions, careful not to draw attention to his interest, learning that official records of the sisters' deaths were sparse, incomplete, and oddly uniform, each certificate listing natural causes without specification, signed by different authorities but written in strikingly similar language, as if copied from a single source. He searched church registries and found gaps where funeral rites should have been recorded, examined property deeds that ended abruptly with no clear transfer of ownership, and read town council notes that referenced Blackwood Farm only obliquely, often with phrases like "matter resolved" or "no further action required," which raised more questions than they answered. What disturbed him most were the journals he discovered by chance in the possession of a retired clerk, leather-bound books filled with personal observations that had never been submitted officially, notes written by men who had been present during the deaths or burials and had later tried, unsuccessfully, to forget what they had seen. These journals spoke of bodies that remained supple and cool but not cold, of skin that resisted discoloration, of eyes that did not cloud, of a stillness that felt less like death and more like suspension. And though the writers often contradicted one another in small details, they agreed on one thing with unsettling consistency: that something about the sisters defied every medical understanding of the time. Harper read these accounts late into the night, his unease growing with each page. Yet rather than recoiling, he felt drawn deeper, convinced that the answers lay not in superstition, but in some undiscovered biological or environmental factor that science had simply not yet named. Against the advice of his peers, he travelled to the outskirts of Blackwood Farm, finding the land exactly as described decades earlier, overgrown, silent, and heavy with a sense of abandonment that felt intentional rather than accidental, as if the place itself had chosen to be forgotten. He did not dig, did not disturb the ground, but he walked the perimeter, took soil samples discreetly, examined the well from a distance, and noted the unusual stillness of the surrounding wildlife, recording everything meticulously in his own journal, which he intended to submit to a medical society once his investigation was complete. Over time, Harper began to notice patterns in the older journals that others had missed: references to headaches, vivid dreams, a sense of pressure or unease experienced by anyone who spent too long near the graves. And though he initially dismissed these as psychological effects of fear, he could not ignore the fact that even hardened men reported similar sensations independently of one another. When Harper attempted to access the sealed graves officially, presenting his credentials and framing his request as a matter of public health and scientific advancement, he was met with polite but firm resistance. His letters returned unanswered, his requests delayed indefinitely, and when he persisted, he was invited to a private meeting with members of the local council, where he was advised, not threatened but warned, that reopening the matter would bring no benefit to anyone and could invite consequences beyond his understanding. The tone of the conversation unsettled him more than any outright refusal would have, because it carried an undercurrent of genuine fear rather than bureaucratic caution. And when he pressed for clarification, the room fell into silence, broken only by the statement that some things were best left untouched. Undeterred, Harper continued his research in isolation, corresponding secretly with colleagues in larger cities, sharing his findings without naming the location, and though some responded with interest, others urged him to abandon the pursuit, suggesting that he was allowing folklore to cloud his judgment. The turning point came when Harper obtained a copy of a letter written by the original attending doctor, a man long deceased, whose official reports had been bland and uninformative, but whose private correspondence revealed a very different story, describing his attempt to perform a limited post-mortem on one of the sisters and the immediate and overwhelming resistance he felt, not from the women present, but from the environment itself, a sudden dizziness, blurred vision, and an instinctive certainty that proceeding would be a grave mistake, sensation so powerful that he abandoned the examination without fully understanding why. The letter ended abruptly with a single line written shakily, stating that knowledge sometimes demands a price that the seeker is not prepared to pay. Reading those words, Harper felt a chill that lingered long after he closed the page, yet instead of retreating, his resolve hardened, convinced that the refusal to study the sisters was not born of ignorance, but of something discovered and deliberately concealed. He prepared a comprehensive manuscript detailing every piece of evidence he had gathered, every anomaly documented, every unanswered question, framing the case as an unprecedented opportunity to advance medical understanding of preservation, death, and environmental influence on the human body, and submitted it to a prominent medical journal, confident that reason would prevail. The response came weeks later, brief and dismissive, rejecting the manuscript without explanation, and when Harper inquired further, he received a private letter advising him to redirect his efforts toward more conventional research if he wished to maintain his professional standing. Confused and increasingly isolated, Harper found doors closing around him, invitations withdrawn, correspondence unanswered, until it became clear that his interest in Blackwood Farm had marked him as someone unwise to engage wit. His final journal entries grew darker, noting increased fatigue, recurring dreams of lantern light and frozen ground, a sensation of being watched even when alone, and though there is no record of his death, his writings cease abruptly, his papers discovered years later among his effects, unpublished and largely ignored. To this day, historians debate whether Elias Harper uncovered something genuinely extraordinary or simply fell victim to obsession, but the pattern remains undeniable, that every serious attempt to study the Four Sisters was met not with debate or refutation, but with silence, obstruction, and erasure, as though the very act of inquiry triggered a collective instinct to turn away. The mystery of Blackwood Farm persisted not because it lacked evidence, but because those who encountered that evidence chose, consciously or not, to step back from its implications, leaving behind a trail of abandoned notes, sealed records, and unanswered questions that suggest the truth was never beyond reach, only deliberately avoided, waiting beneath the soil for a time when curiosity might once again outweigh fear. By the turn of the 20th century, the story of Blackwood Farm had entered a strange new phase, one no longer shaped by superstition alone, but by deliberate absence, by missing files, altered records, and a quiet but persistent resistance that followed anyone who tried to approach the case with modern scientific intent. And it was during this period that the phrase began to circulate in academic whispers that the Four Sisters were a mystery science refused to study, not because it could not, but because it would not. As medical science advanced and preservation techniques, toxicology and pathology became more sophisticated, historians and researchers occasionally stumbled upon references to the sisters while reviewing 19th-century anomalies only. To find that every promising thread led to a dead end, archives that should have held coroner reports, instead containing blank pages, museum collections listing samples that were never catalogued, and university correspondences that mentioned Maine in vague cautionary terms without ever specifying why. One researcher from New York, a professor of early forensic medicine, noted in a private letter that the Blackwood deaths represented a statistical impossibility given the environmental conditions and time period. Yet when he attempted to request access to burial records through official channels, he received a reply stating that the graves were classified as protected historical sites due to community sensitivity, a phrase so vague it effectively shut down further inquiry. Similar language appeared again and again, regardless of who asked or from where, as though a template response had been agreed upon long ago and simply reused whenever curiosity resurfaced. What made the resistance more unsettling was that it was never aggressive, never openly hostile, but always calm, measured, and absolute, leaving researchers unsure whether they were being blocked by bureaucracy, tradition, or something far more intentional. In several documented cases, scholars who pushed too hard found their funding delayed, their projects reassigned, or their reputations subtly undermined through professional channels, not enough to ruin them outright, but enough to make continued pursuit costly. A biologist from Montreal who specialized in soil-based preservation theories withdrew her proposal abruptly after visiting Maine, later telling a colleague only that the land around Blackwood Farm felt wrong and that she had no desire to return, refusing to elaborate further even years later. Government involvement, if any, was never officially acknowledged, yet freedom of information requests led decades later produced inconsistent results, some returning nothing at all, others containing redacted pages with entire paragraphs blacked out, dates removed, names erased, and in one particularly disturbing instance, a document stamped and signed but containing no text whatsoever, as if the content had been removed so completely that even its absence was left unexplained. Local resistance played its part as well, not in the form of protests or vocal opposition, but through silence and evasion, with descendants of those who had lived near Blackwood Farm declining interviews, changing subjects, or claiming ignorance about stories their grandparents had once told freely, as though memory itself had been trained to forget. A folklorist conducting oral histories in the 1970s noted that whenever the Four Sisters were mentioned, interviewees exhibited signs of discomfort inconsistent with mere superstition, avoiding eye contact, lowering their voices, and often ending the conversation altogether. And though she published a limited account of these reactions, she later admitted that she omitted several details after receiving anonymous advice, suggesting that further exploration would be unwise. Even advances in technology failed to penetrate the mystery, as ground-penetrating radar surveys proposed in the late 20th century were denied permits under environmental protection laws, despite no clear evidence that the land met the criteria. And satellite imaging of the area showed nothing remarkable beyond an unusual density in the soil near the old well, a finding that was dismissed as natural variation without further investigation. What baffled scientists most was not the lack of explanation, but the consistency of obstruction across disciplines and generations, suggesting not a single cover-up, but an inherited caution passed down quietly, reinforced by experience rather than instruction. Some theorized that early investigators had discovered a contagious pathogen or environmental toxin capable of altering decomposition, and that suppressing the case had been a crude but effective form of containment, while others suggested that the preservation phenomena challenged fundamental assumptions about death itself, posing philosophical questions that institutions were unwilling to confront. A smaller, more controversial group proposed that the resistance stemmed from something encountered during those early aborted examinations, an effect on the observer rather than the subject, a psychological or neurological response triggered by proximity to the bodies or the land, explaining the dizziness, fear, and instinctive withdrawal reported by multiple individuals across time. This theory, though speculative, gained quiet traction because it accounted for the most puzzling aspect of the case, the way rational, educated people chose not to pursue answers even when logic and opportunity aligned. In unpublished notes found among the papers of a Cold War-era defense researcher, there is a brief mention of anomalous preservation events in New England, followed by the handwritten remark, non-replicable, observer compromised, implying that the act of observation itself altered the investigator's capacity to proceed, though the note provides no further detail and references no official study. The refusal to study the Four Sisters thus became self-perpetuating, each generation inheriting the unease of the last, each new inquiry quietly discouraged before it could reach momentum, creating a void where knowledge should have been, and over time that void became more significant than any explanation might have been. The academic world learned to treat Blackwood Farm not as an unsolved problem, but as a non-problem, something acknowledged only obliquely, referenced without detail, and excluded from serious discourse, while popular culture, sensing the absence, filled it with speculation, horror, and myth, further distancing the truth from careful examination. Yet beneath all of this, the sealed graves remained untouched, untested, holding whatever answers they always had, while science, a discipline built on curiosity and challenge, turned away not out of ignorance, but out of a quiet collective decision that some questions carried risks that could not be measured, let alone justified. And so the Four Sisters remained where they had always been, at the edge of understanding, not because they were beyond study, but because study itself seemed to recoil from them, as if knowledge, when it drew too close, recognized something it was not meant to claim. What remains after all the documents end, after the journals fall silent, after the last academic refusal is filed away and forgotten, is the question that never found a safe place to rest, the question that lingers beneath the frozen soil of Maine like a held breath, waiting, and it is here, in the absence of certainty, that the truth of the four sisters becomes most unsettling, because every theory that survives does so not by proof, but by endure. Ants. Some who studied the case from afar believe the answer lay in the land itself, that Blackwood Farm sat atop a rare convergence of minerals that altered the chemistry of water and soil in ways 19th-century science could not detect. A slow and invisible influence that entered the body over years, changing cellular decay, suppressing bacteria, preserving tissue beyond death, and while modern geology might now identify such elements, the refusal to sample the site ensured the theory remained permanently hypothetical, a possibility locked behind sealed ground and legal barriers. Others argued for a genetic explanation, proposing that the sisters shared a hereditary condition so rare it bordered on myth, one that affected metabolism, immune response, and post-mortem processes, a mutation passed down quietly through generations, unnoticed until all four women displayed its final, incomprehensible effect. Yet this theory faltered under scrutiny as well, because no records of similar cases existed in their lineage, and no living descendants could be found to test it, as if the bloodline itself had ended deliberately with them. A more troubling idea persisted in whispered margins, suggesting that the sisters were not merely victims of an anomaly, but participants in something intentional, a ritualized isolation, a chosen withdrawal from the world, guided by knowledge inherited from their parents or from something older, something bound to the land long before Blackwood Farm was named, an idea reinforced by the sisters' identical routines, their refusal of outside help, their synchronized endurance, and the eerie calm with which each death was met, as though it had been expected, even prepared for. Those who favored this interpretation pointed to the lanterns that burned through storms, the well no one else would drink from, the unmarked graves placed close together, not randomly but with deliberate spacing, forming patterns only visible from above, patterns later glimpsed briefly in aerial photographs before being dismissed as coincidence. There were even claims, impossible to verify yet impossible to erase, that the sisters' bodies were positioned differently in death than in life, seated, folded, aligned with windows and cardinal directions, details omitted from official notes but preserved in the private journals of those who had seen them, suggesting that death itself was treated not as an end, but as a state to be entered correctly. Skeptics dismissed these ideas as narrative embellishment, the natural evolution of fear filling gaps left by missing facts. Yet the persistence of these patterns across independent accounts raised uncomfortable questions about how much coincidence could reasonably be tolerated. Perhaps the most disturbing theory was the one no institution would ever record, the notion that whatever preserved the sisters also resisted observation, that the anomaly was not passive but reactive, influencing perception, decision-making, and even memory, explaining why doctors felt compelled to stop examinations, why researchers abandoned projects without clear reason, why entire communities learned to forget without being told to do so. If this were true, then the sealed graves were not just containment, but compliance, a collective surrender to something that demanded distance rather than understanding. And in this interpretation, science did not refuse to study the four sisters out of fear or superstition, but because at some fundamental level it could not, because the tools of inquiry themselves became unreliable in their presence. This idea found eerie support in the way personal accounts ended, not with conclusions, but with silence. Journals stopping mid-sentence, letters trailing off, careers quietly shifting away from the subject, as though attention itself carried a cost that no one could fully articulate. Over time, Blackwood Farm transformed into a kind of negative space in historical study, a location defined not by what was known, but by what could not be pursued, and this absence shaped the narrative more powerfully than any discovery might have. Visitors who stood near the property in later years reported nothing dramatic, no apparitions, no sudden dread, only a subtle pressure, a sense of being slightly out of alignment, of thoughts slipping away before they could fully form, and many left convinced that there was simply nothing there, unaware that this very conviction mirrored the experiences of those who came before them. The graves remained sealed, protected by law, tradition, and indifference, their exact locations growing uncertain as markers eroded and memories blurred, until even the act of digging would have required guesswork, a practical obstacle that further ensured the mystery would remain intact. And yet, despite everything, the story endured, resurfacing whenever someone noticed the pattern. 4 women, same place, same preservation, same refusal, a configuration too precise to dismiss entirely, too unresolved to close. In the end, the truth of the 4 sisters may not be a single answer but a boundary, a line beyond which explanation becomes unstable, where observation alters outcome, and where knowledge demands more than curiosity is willing to pay. Whether the cause was chemical, genetic, environmental, ritualistic, or something that defies classification altogether, the result was the same, a perfect convergence of death without decay, memory without record, and inquiry without conclusion. Blackwood Farm remains quiet now. Trees grown thick where paths once lay, the well hidden beneath moss and leaves, the ground smooth and unbroken, and beneath it all, 4 sealed graves continue to hold whatever they have always held, not just bodies, but a warning written without words, that some mysteries do not persist because they lack answers, but because the act of uncovering them changes the one who tries, and so the 4 sisters of Maine remain exactly where history left them, untouched, untested, and unresolved. A macabre truth buried not by ignorance, but by an unspoken agreement between fear, reason, and time.